Welcome to today's grad and postdoc scholarly talk series on how university finance works. And this is something that a lot of people throw words around like research expenditures, overhead, philanthropy, corporate and industrial gifts, grants and contracts. And what does all this stuff mean? Like where does it come from? Where does the money flow? And this is not something that even most professors spend a lot of time thinking about. But I know that a lot of you are interested in careers in academia and are postdocs or will be postdocs and may be assistant professors someday or may go into university administration. And even if not, you may be curious about these things because they kind of affect the decisions that we make on a day-to-day basis. So who cares about university finance? Well, most of us work in this environment, but we take financial considerations for granted. Why is it this way, and why not some other way? Knowing more about university finance can help us make certain kinds of decisions and help us understand the decisions of others. It also, actually, knowing why things the way they are help me at least cope with stress because a lot of times as a PI of a lab, I want to know why a lab budget is the way it is. Why do I have to include certain line items in a budget? And all information is good information, at least I think so. People ask me, if you knew the day that you would die and how, would you want to know? And I think the answer is yes, mainly because I would want to know how much caffeine I could drink, or if having that extra glass of wine is going to be the thing that did me in. So I would find that profoundly relieving, I think. So I believe that all information is good information. Also, universities are sometimes compared to corporations. Sometimes they're even called corporations, but they're not for-profit corporations in the same sense that Ford or General Motors or Samsung is. So in what ways is a university like or unlike a corporation? I think that the examination of incentives and human nature in any context are almost always interesting. So it's interesting to see how concepts from behavioral psychology or from behavioral economics and psychology even apply to university decision making. There's also a perception that it's all funny money, like, well, we'll spend this money on this grant, and then, at some point we'll bill the federal government for it, and stuff kind of happens behind the scenes, and stuff eventually gets paid for, even if a lot of money is changing hands, and we're not exactly sure where it's all going. That can obscure the sort of financial realities that exist in any complex organization, but especially a university. And it has been described in a book that I'm about to cite on the next slide that university finance is a lot like trying to discover the shape of an elephant from a bunch of people that are wearing blindfolds and sitting in one spot. So one person's feeling the foot, and it might be, well, this is a big like tower or something. And someone else is feeling the belly, and they're like, well, this is a big like ball-shaped sculpture. But it depends on the positionality of the person doing the assaying of the elephant to figure out what it is, and it's going to depend a lot on that perspective. So what I hope to do with this talk is to kind of give a high-level overview of what some of these terms mean and where the money flows so that you can kind of zoom out and see what the whole elephant looks like. So I'm going to give a huge shout out to this book, this brand new book that just came out by Andrew Comrie called Like Nobody's Business, An Insider's Guide to How U.S. University Finances Really Work. It is an open access textbook. Anyone can download the slides and view graphs. And I'm not presenting he didn't make slides, but I borrowed extensively from the graphs. And in particular, I was about halfway through designing this talk when I discovered this book, and I'm like, oh, that's a really good way to present the data. And he combed through just mountains of publicly available information to come up with the pie charts that I'm going to show you. So I did not make the graphs myself here. I found this book a few days ago, and it really changed my approach to making this talk, which I knew I was going to be giving for the last few months. All right, so what's the function of a university? We know that a university has a special relationship to knowledge. The first and foremost core function of a university is to transmit knowledge. The second function, so transmission of knowledge, what is that? Well, it's traditional teaching and learning, classroom environment, even special seminars like this, we're transmitting knowledge. The second is to create knowledge. So creation of knowledge is otherwise known as the function of research. So we're creating new knowledge that eventually we will want to transmit. And I think that the educational and research missions of universities are pretty well known, but there's a third category of function, and that is curation. So if there was a calamity, a disaster, a political regime that came to power in a society where knowledge was really under threat. Well, universities, university libraries, university personnel are the repositories of this knowledge, and it's part of the social contract with universities that we are the curators of knowledge. We've had a lot of knowledge transmitted to us in classes and in books, in reading and special seminars, and we've created a lot of knowledge in our research. And then the idea or our charge is to curate this knowledge. What are the activities? So when an assistant professor goes to assistant professor school, just kidding, there's no such thing, to learn how to become an assistant professor, they learn that the three activities are teaching, research, and service. 1 and 2 on the activity list have a one-to-one mapping with the relationship to knowledge on the first list, but service is actually a bit different. So service means service to the stakeholders of a university, so that is the public who allows us to operate in their midst. It means to the people who we give our knowledge to, for better or worse, hopefully usually for better, and also to funding agencies and ultimately the taxpayers in a given society. Service can also mean service to each other as scientists and engineers and as people engaged in learning. And that could be peer review of grants, peer review of papers, peer review of scholarly presentations, creation of symposia and journals and editorial work and that kind of thing. There are many different kinds of universities and colleges. If you look at R1, so R1 is the Carnegie classification system. UCSD is an example of an R1, very high research activity. There are 80 public R1 universities and 34 private R1 universities. R2 is the next level of research activity. There's 74 public, 28 private. So an example of an R2 private might be the Rochester Institute of Technology. A public R2 might be the Worcester Polytechnic Institute in Massachusetts, or certain campuses of the California State system, whereas most of the UC campuses fall under the R1 category. There are also a series of campuses that fall into the R3 to primarily undergraduate colleges. And the criteria that I'm going to use for the pie charts that I'll show in terms of total budgets and expenditures, when I don't specify R1, R2, and so forth, are going to be for nominally 4-year institutions. So what are the ground rules for nonprofit universities? So we know that most universities are nonprofits. And there are some universities that are for-profit, like University of Phoenix and DeVry and things like that, that have come under scrutiny the last decade or so for kind of, let's say, coercive tactics on the way that they recruit students, in particular take federal grant and loan dollars, whereas in general nonprofit universities do not engage in that. If we're considering nonprofit universities only, and that's for good reason, all R1s are going to be nonprofit, for example. In a nonprofit, nominally revenues will equal expenses. That's not always true. But we don't talk about net income as in profit the same way that we do in a for-profit corporation's balance sheet. Because there are no profits, there are no dividends in terms of cash or stock to investors. There are no year-end bonuses to its administrators as a function of economic performance. However, there are losses and leftovers that occur in university budgets. They are called for nonprofits not profits, but margins. Deficits occur as well. They're covered by the institution's credit, and surpluses, otherwise known as marginal revenues, are reinvested into various strategic activities, capital building projects, rainy day funds, and so on. In fact, surpluses can be utilized in emergencies like the COVID-19 pandemic, and oftentimes a measure of how healthy a university's surplus money that's carried forward from year to year and reinvested is given in terms of how many days of no net revenue could that pot of money last. How long could you sustain university operations if you had no money incoming? And that could be 6 months, 8 months, a year, generally not greater than a year for the typical public R1. Excessive surplus leads to regulatory scrutiny. It is often the case where you will see the California legislature call forward administrators from the UC or Cal State system and say, why do you have all this money left over on your budget? It's why PIs are often under pressure to spend down the money on their books in terms of money that is gift money, money that can be used for any purpose ostensibly, and it doesn't look good to have that money on their books from year to year because it contributes to this unspent surplus, which some people in society regard as excessive. And it's regarded as excessive even if it can be regarded as excessive even if the business purpose is legitimate. So it could be reserved for a capital project. They could be unspent gift funds. You're not going to get a gift for like $100,000 as a PI every year. So when you do get it, you need to make sure it lasts. It could be used for financial aid. It could be as a buffer against falling state appropriations, and so on. What are some total university budgets? What do they look like? So in the blue is public universities, and if you look at the R1 category, so that is right here and right here, this is public, this is private, you can see that the budgets, these are in thousands of millions of dollars, we're at about maybe 1.75 billion average over all public R1s, and about 3 billion exactly for private R1s. What's a private R1? Stanford, Boston University, Harvard University. In fact, if you look at the Fortune 500 in terms of revenues, I think 8 R1 universities would actually qualify as a member of the Fortune 500 if you look at revenues, and that's going to be somewhere in the $6 to $8 billion range as the revenue cutoff. So these are quite hulking organizations. What are some revenue sources? And these are non-hospital revenues. So a lot of universities, a lot of R1 universities have hospitals attached to them. And they are free to either report that income as part of the university income or report it separately. This is considering only the non-hospital revenue sources. The biggest chunk, let's take R1 public, because this is sort of more of the flavor of what UCSD is going to look like. Most of the money comes in the form of tuition and fees. And this other big orange chunk here is state appropriations. A public or private university, R1, is not going to have this state appropriations. It's going to have a big red corner of the pie chart that is investment income, and that is income that is derived from the endowment, payouts from the endowment. Whereas for public universities, it's a relatively smaller chunk. The rest of these chunks are actually similar. This sort of cyan region here, this is grants and contracts, interesting to any scientist or engineer, because of a lot of our livelihood depends on these public, more or less public revenue sources that could also be foundation or industrially derived. Those are different from this this sort of yellow section of the pie, which is gifts. Most of those gifts tend to be expendable gifts, so you're just going to spend it. You're not going to add it to the endowment and pay expenses using the capital gains from that endowment, so investment income, but rather you're going to take it in and spend it out in that fiscal year, some predetermined amount of time. Auxiliaries. So auxiliaries are things like athletics, sports. Conference services is a big one, especially over the summer when all of this classroom space goes unused most of the time. Universities make money off of it. They rent it out to various conferences and use it as an important revenue stream. All right, what are the main drivers of tuition? So that big blue chunk is tuition. So the drivers are often described in terms of two different laws named after economists. One was Bowen's Law for universities and nonprofits, where the goals are educational excellence, prestige, and influence. And in this quest to achieve these goals, there's no limit to the money an institution could spend. The third law is raise all the money you can and spend all that you raise. This is sometimes called the Cookie Monster model, although this might be insulting to Cookie Monster. The idea is you just take all the cookies and you take as much as you can, and then you spend it. Then there's the Baumol cost-disease effect. And this is an economic theory that says that service sector wages increase in areas with stagnant labor productivity. What is stagnant labor productivity? Well, two sectors suffer from stagnant labor productivity, and that is education and healthcare. Because the more professors you have, the number of students you can educate rises linearly with the number of professors you have, at least using most common models. Just like in healthcare, a doctor can only see one patient at a time. So, excuse me while I clear my throat because that Cookie Monster thing was inadvised. Yeah, that's what I tell my daughter when she's like screaming. I'm like, you're gonna start coughing. You're gonna throw your voice out. Yeah, don't do the Cookie Monster voice. Okay, so what this says is that in economic sectors and where the labor productivity is stagnant, those people face pressures from other sectors like industrial sectors where they could move and make more money. So for example, an academic researcher could be working in industry for more money. That is often the case. And as a result, there's a bidding war for that talent, and a nonprofit institution, even though there's stagnant labor productivity, have to pay that person even more to retain them. So that's a driver of cost. Increasing the scale of education adds to the increase in costs. So you get more and more people on campus. You just have to charge more because there are more services around. So both effects contribute to cost. There is a real battle in the literature on higher education as to what is the greater driver of tuition, and you can find arguments in favor of both, and I'm not going to take a side in that particular argument. So both effects contribute to the costs, though increases in purchasing power of consumers over time. So the consumer price index tends to offset these increases in tuition, even though they make a lot of headlines whenever the tuition goes up, right? But the tuition revenue actually doesn't cover all of the education costs. Actually, it only covers about 2/3 of them because of financial aid. So there are institutional expenses, so this orange part, which is covered in public institutions by state appropriations and in private institutions by investment income. Then you have you have restricted funds. So these are funds, I'm going to talk more about restricted versus unrestricted in a moment, but these are funds where say this is a scholarship fund. So it's a gift. You can only use it on a scholarship. You can only use it on someone studying history of the Civil War or something like that, and it's restricted. There are state and local, like these are like Pell Grants, other financial aid programs, and other types of subsidized Department of Education type expenditures. There are different colors of money. So all money is green, I guess, depending on what kind of currency you're looking at. In the US, it's green. And but in a university system, you can't use every kind of money on every type of expense. So they call that colors of money. It's also closely tied to the concept of cash flow. I first learned about cash flow back when I was chair of the grad student and postdoc council in the chemistry department at Harvard when I was a grad student. And in 2008, right when the financial crisis was starting to happen, and Harvard's endowment went from like $36 billion to like $20 billion in the matter of a couple weeks, and there was this big headline that said that no hot meals will be served in the Harvard dining halls. And I thought that was an absolutely ridiculous thing, because $20 billion is still a lot of endowment money, and you should be able to cover those costs with the payout from the endowment. And at the time, I wasn't thinking about people making omelets. I was thinking about oatmeal in a hot bin because they couldn't afford the propane or whatever to keep it lit. But anyway, they were really talking about the labor of the short order cooks at the dining halls. But anyway, that was my deficiency in understanding at the time. But the department manager at the time, who was sort of like a retired Marine officer who had spent time in as an administrator of Bell Labs before. I don't know what was a tougher environment, the Marines or Bell Labs, but anyway, I'll leave that to history to decide. He said it's not a problem of money, it's not a problem of endowment or dollar value, it's a problem of cash flow. So he said we're working in very strict constraints, and it may be that the dining hall, if they get their budget cut by some marginal 10%, then they still need to buy all the food and they still need to pay the utilities, right? But maybe it's that omelet in the morning that's the easiest thing to cut, and that's what he meant by cash flow. So the cash flow is affected by the origin of the revenue. So the first kind of cash is restricted, and that is grants. So grants are restricted to direct costs only, the part of a grant that is a restricted cost category is the direct cost. That's the cost of personnel, that's the cost of chemical reagents, that's the cost of paying to use supercomputer time or to pay for clean room time or makerspace time. Then there are expendable gifts. So a gift usually comes with a gift letter, say from an individual or a foundation or a corporate partner that says you have to use this gift on this particular expense, like a scholarship or a summer research program. Then there's endowment income for restricted gifts. Now you would think that if you gave a university like $1 billion, I don't think anyone's ever done that. But say you give a university $1 billion, and that you would think that as a university who's making like a 5% capital gain or capital gains income from that would say, well, okay, I get to use that $50 million annual 5% payout on anything I want. But no, it's stipulated in the gift letter for most endowment income that the interest on that gift has to also go to the same cause that the principal went to. And that's an often misunderstood fact. There are also unrestricted colors of money. So unrestricted funds come from tuition and fees. That's why a university wants its tuition and fees. That's why they're increasing. Unrestricted funds come from investment interest, so that is the university's own money, things that originated as unrestricted investment income, non-expendable gifts, state appropriations, or tuition that that are now, it's like, laundered is not the right word, but it goes into the same pool, right? It goes into the university's pool. It's not tied to a particular task. And then that money gets invested, and then you can use the capital gains on that to do what you want with it. State appropriations are unrestricted. Indirect costs on grants are unrestricted. We'll talk more about IDC in a moment. Indirect costs, also called overhead. And auxiliary income tends to be unrestricted. So the money that goes into the sports team when you sell out a football stadium, not that UCSD would know anything about that, but when you sell out a sports stadium, that money, some of it goes back into the operations of the sports team, of course, but doesn't cost that much money by comparison to how much is made. And then investments. So what kinds of investments do universities make? So universities often have a vast portfolio of investment products that they use. Those could be public stocks and bonds. They often are invested in ventures and private equity funds as well, and other types of financial securities. Now, note that some money could be unrestricted from one person's perspective, but restricted from the university's perspective. So if I get a grant, or if I get a gift from a donor, it's unrestricted in that I could use it on a piece of equipment, a chemical, supercomputer time, or a grad student or postdoc salary. Whereas the university would see that same gift as restricted because it's restricted to my lab. Philanthropy is increasingly a big part of university finances, and it's always been so for private universities, but it's increasingly important for publics as well. And it is the signature revenue source for private universities because remember, they don't have state appropriations. They have government grants, but they don't have money coming directly from the state unless it's a grant. What is a funder type and why do they give? Well, companies give money because of the potential to recruit students. It's also useful for marketing and name recognition. So this is this room is a person and the building is a person, but the ASML Conference Center is ASML, Semiconductor Manufacturing Light Source Company. there's a sense of corporate responsibility that corporations need to be investing in the future. Ultimately, they're going to be hiring people that are educated at institutions of higher learning, and also as a means of information exchange. So oftentimes a company will give money to a consortium of researchers at a university because that consortium of researchers have an annual symposium, and if the companies send people to those symposia, they get to take notes on the absolute most cutting-edge research that's being done by people that got trained at the best universities in the world, which I would call, a little bit cynically, low-cost consulting services. And private individuals, they want to feel good. They want to make a difference in the world. They like having their name recognized. They like having their name on the building. Foundations, so those are based on either corporations. So corporations often have a foundation that came from that institution, but also from families, wealthy families or wealthy individuals. And they are also types of nonprofits, just like a university, and they are fulfilling a primary donor's mandate or a group of donors' mandates. What is the mandate? I'm interested in cancer research. I'm interested in energy mitigation, environmental mitigation strategies. What are examples of auxiliaries? In general, they are conference services, so summer stuff, athletics, restaurants, stores like the campus bookstore and why the UCSD t-shirt is $50, housing, and research-related stuff. So auxiliaries, outside users pay user fees like recharge. Also inside users pay these fees too. But that's okay, right? Because we're like a domestic economy. A lot of noise is made in Congress about trade deficits and so forth, but 70% of at least 70% of the US economy is domestic spending. So same thing at a university. Not that it's that ratio, but a lot of the spending just changes hands. It might have cost money to have this talk in this room. I'm not sure. It was invisible to me. Clean room fees. Actually, I don't think it was, but there are rooms on campus where it does cost money. So clean room fees, outside and inside users use those auxiliaries. Animal facilities are a big one for people doing animal research. Shared instruments. So this is especially true at universities that have a partnership with a national lab, like a synchrotron radiation source or something like that. So just like domestic spending in the US economy, some cash appears on both sides of the ledger as a revenue and then later again as an expense. What about royalties and entrepreneurship returns? This is especially important to engineering students, faculty, postdocs, because many of you are involved in technologies that have commercial potential. And there's the potential for patent royalties, equity stakes in startups, and some universities are more successful than others in capturing some of the value that is created by these entrepreneurial routes. The total revenue across all R1s is modest, so it's less than about $20 million per year on average, and the average R1 sprouts about 10 startups per year. There are about 70 issued patents per year. However, it is high value money. The money that does come in is high value because it's portable, it's unrestricted. You can use it on anything. Of course, there are some famous whale cases, like Stanford made over $300 million from the Google IPO because Larry and Sergey, when they started Google, needed to get the IP from their home institution. And because they didn't have any money, Stanford gave them the IP for an equity stake in the company that they cashed out as soon as Google had an IPO. Carnegie Mellon recently got money from an infringement settlement for $700 million, and this is not, and this was money based on a lawsuit. Actually, litigation of IP cases is very rare Even for Stanford, which is known as having a particularly aggressive IP defense policy, they've only litigated less than 20 times in the entire history of Stanford, which is pretty surprising. These big whale cases make the news, but it's not the norm. Gonna switch gears and talk for a minute about core activities versus leveraged activities and how these revenue sources are different. So at its core function, a university is nothing if it doesn't educate people, right? So there's tuition involved. This is the case for public universities. This is the pie chart that I showed earlier for publics. And about half of the activity is primary activity, and these are revenues that you get based on the fact that you're educating people. So this is the state appropriation for educating people, this is the tuition you get for educating people, and here's the investment income that you get for educating people. Now, because you have all these people and this knowledge located on a single square mile of land and buildings, you can leverage the presence of all of those individuals and all of that smarts into doing research. You can leverage it into getting money from sports teams. Because if you just started a sports team that wasn't affiliated with anything, like look at those replacement NFL leagues and see where they all went. Nowhere. That's where. So you have to have this brand recognition that's based on these core revenue generating activities before you can leverage them into these other kind of value added activities. What if you look at the expenses by nature of expense? So people are by far the most expensive part of the expense puzzle. So salaries and wages 40%, then when you add employee fringe benefits, so that's health insurance and everything, you get up to almost 2/3 of the pie just with the people. Then operations and maintenance, some of those charges are also people related. Depreciation of capital assets, interest, so this is finance charges on debt. Ideally, you would like your debt financing charges to be less than your investment income. If there's not, there's a big problem and you need to fire the financial staff. But oftentimes what you'll find is that university endowments are so big that they can get a better deal on a capital project by borrowing the money as opposed to spending principal endowment or gifts on it, because you can get more money from capital gains than you can lose by paying borrowing costs, just because of the size and scale and the types of investment vehicles that a large institution has access to. So that's nature of expenses. What about function of expenses? So there are some blurred lines here, but in general, if you look at, this is overall, but let's look at R1 public, most of it is instruction, then a big chunk is research, some of it is academic support, so staff support, classroom stuff, institutional infrastructure, auxiliary enterprises is also an expensive chunk. That's probably a lot less for us, actually, because we don't have big, like a football program, and basketball, great as it is lesser known than it is at other places. All right. Terminology, there's some really confusing terminology around university finance. And the reason is that the reason is that we like things that are easy to measure, and expenditures go through one straw, and income comes through many straws. So it's a lot easier to measure expenditures than it is to measure revenues for a number of reasons. And so if you look at this chart on the left, these are the revenues on the left from different sources. This is tuition, this is state appropriations, I forgot what type of a university, oh yeah, R1 public, versus expenditures. And expenditures is a little less than revenue. That's weird, right? Why would that be? For a number of reasons. In academia, we always like things that are easy to measure. So people who are not in your field can count your papers, right? And my PhD advisor used to say, not everyone can read, but everyone can count. And then in finance, they say that what gets measured gets managed. So what do we measure? We measure expenditures because revenues, lots of sources, expenditures, one outlet. So research expenditures are a comically misunderstood jargon. It sounds like expenses, but it's really reflective of revenues. It is money spent on research, if you're talking about research expenditures, and it's derived from external sources. It's not that your costs went up because your expenditures went up. It's because you got a lot more money and you can spend it, and it's easier to spend read your credit card balance than it is to see what all the money came from. Expenditures are generally smaller than revenues. So for one thing, expenditures are a lagging indicator. For a growing school like the Jacobs School of Engineering at UCSD, and for each one of our departments, on average, the revenues are growing and expenditures represent last year's revenues. It's also difficult to account for multi-PI grants and subcontracts where you have to pay another university, and also there is the case where some types of revenue sources are retained for future years and do not appear in the expenditure category even for the next fiscal year. This is just kind of fun to see where this is. So research expenditures by university, UCSD is right here. It is the 7th one on the list, at least this list in fiscal year 2017, but it's the 5th in terms of public universities. This is in some ways a disingenuous plot because it can mix hospital and non-hospital income, it mixes research universities that have hospitals and research institutions that are that have national labs or Defense Department affiliated laboratories as a part of their campus. So, for example, Johns Hopkins University also has the Applied or Advanced Physics Laboratory, which is a DoD-funded research institution that consumes about half of these research expenditures. So it's not just what's happening on that exact campus, it's everything that's included in part of the on the balance sheet. Zooming in down to a very fine grain on a particular research lab budget, this is kind of what it looks like. If your doctor very famous, you might budget 1 month and one summer month, which might be $11,000. A graduate research assistant at 0.5 FTE, don't get mad at me. 9 months fall and spring could be $25,000. Fringe benefits for faculty and the GSR. You might have equipment, direct costs, materials and supplies, and then tuition remission. Why is it tuition remission and not flat out tuition, straight up tuition? The reason is that you can't spend federal dollars on tuition. So what we do, what the system does, what the system has found it advantageous to do essentially all universities, is to pay the tuition remission as a benefit to the student so that tuition is not charged to the student. Now, the student never sees the money, but that's the bin that it goes into. So it's paid out as a benefit so as the university does not charge it directly to the student. Value judgments aside, I'm just stating facts here. Then you come up with cost categories of modified total direct costs. Now, a direct cost includes salary, reagents, recharge, so access to shared facilities. It does not include tuition remission because that would be double dipping. That would be taking extra money from the grant and putting it into the university's unrestricted category, and The federal government does not like that, would not like that. And the other thing is equipment, because equipment, I think the reason is that equipment depreciates. It becomes less valuable over time. And well, that's just my best guess. So you get a total modified direct cost, and then there's an indirect cost, which is charged on top of that modified direct cost, which at UCSD is currently 58% of direct costs. So if you have 100K in direct costs, you bill the government for 158K, and that extra 58K goes into the unrestricted budget of the university. Okay, so what about the connection between finance and strategy? So research is really expensive, and grant agencies and philanthropies get access to highly leveraged assets. So us in this room, right? Nobody thinks that they're getting paid enough for what they do, right? I think that's more true in academia than it is in most other sectors of the economy. So we're here for the educational purpose, but also because we produce research results. Also, anytime I do research during the academic year when I'm paid to teach and do service, anytime I do research, the funding agency is getting that work from me for free because I'm a leveraged asset to them. I'm here for the primary activity, which is education, and I happen to do some research in my free time, and the agency gets that work from me for free, plain and simple. Grad student time on TA-ships doing sponsored research are also working for the research agency for free. I mean, I know the accounting doesn't say that, but it's true, right? If you're doing a 50% TA-ship and a 50% and a 12 units of $299, if you're working on that grant, the grantor is getting that labor from you for free. The budget does not compensate. So the university budgets that we send to the granting agencies don't make up for the expense of research. Universities could be argued to lose money on research, just like Walmart loses money on groceries. I don't know if that's still true, but there are some items called loss leaders, like bread and milk and things that are bizarrely cheap that you buy. Like milk is less expensive than gasoline. Doesn't that seem like weird? Like it's high value, low entropy, proteinaceous product, like is $4 to $5 a gallon? Like that's ridiculous, right? Well, it's artificially cheap because you need milk or bread or whatever, and you need flour. You need to go into the store and get it, and it's so big and bulky and so perishable that you can't stock up on it and buy like a bajillion jugs of milk, right? So those are called loss leaders that gets people into the store. They're also, you could consider them as investments. We're going to lose money here because we're going to gain prestige and impact in these other areas. So even though the indirect cost rate of 58% seems high, it certainly seems high to the PIs, the universities lose actually on that grant like 5 to 10% of the costs per grant, and they get that money from other sources. Sometimes indirect cost returns are issued to PIs in the form of unrestricted research dollars, but oftentimes those moves backfire politically because it looks to the PIs like that indirect cost money was ours to begin with. And you can understand it, right? The misunderstanding, but that's kind of the way it is. So what are these investments made for? Why do we make these investments in research if we don't recoup the cost through the grants and the indirect cost reimbursements? And it's for the public good. It might be the state charter, like it is for the UC system, or the charter that the UC system was created under by the state. And it could be for prestige and cachet. In business speak, we would say that finance yields to strategy in this case. So we're making these investments because we have bigger strategic aims than just the balancing the checkbook, balancing the account statements. So what are the take-home messages? University finance is ubiquitously important, but understood by few, including me. But knowledge of the basics or even the jargon can help you navigate your time in academia and work within it. So there's that old saying, grant me the wisdom to change what I can, leave alone what I can't, and the wisdom to know the difference, or something like that. It's very much how it is working here. There are many different types of universities, and the public R1 university like UCSD is in an elite category. Pay rates and expenses rise over time, but still not as much as goods-producing sectors, for better or worse, just the way it is. I would argue that research can be considered either a loss leader or an investment, depending on what positionality or what perspective you take. And there's no perfect scenario. It's a complex system built on historical accidents, but it's the system we have, such as it is. Thanks for your time, and I'm happy to take questions.